The waiting room smelled like polish and old wood. Expensive leather chairs lined the walls, and every surface seemed to shine under the crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. This wasn't just any music school. This was the Wellington Academy of Music, the kind of place where parents paid more for one semester than most people earned in a year. Daniel sat in the corner, trying to make himself invisible. His sneakers had a hole near the toe that he'd tried to cover with a black marker. It didn't really work. The backpack beside him was borrowed from his cousin, and inside it, he had nothing but a pencil and the crumpled application form his teacher had filled out for him. Around him, other kids waited for their turn. A girl in a velvet dress practiced her violin scales, her bow moving with mechanical precision. Her mother kept adjusting the girl's posture, whispering corrections that sounded more like commands. A boy in a crisp suit sat with a cello between his knees, his father reviewing sheet music and tapping out rhythms on his knee. Everyone seemed to belong here except Daniel. His mom had dropped him off an hour ago before rushing to her shift at the diner. She'd hugged him tight and said, "Just do your best, baby. That's all anyone can ask." But looking around this room, Daniel wasn't sure his best would be anywhere near good enough. The door to the audition hall opened, and a woman stepped out. She was probably in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her posture was so straight it looked uncomfortable, and when she scanned the room, her eyes seemed to calculate the worth of every person there. "Next," she said, her voice cutting through the nervous silence. "Daniel Rodriguez." The whispers started immediately. Daniel heard them even though people tried to be quiet about it. "Who's that?" "I've never heard of him. Look at his shoes. Does he even have an instrument?" Daniel stood up, his legs feeling like they might give out under him. He walked toward the woman who was holding a clipboard and looking at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. "I'm Mrs. Victoria Hayes," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "director of this academy for 32 years. Follow me." The audition hall was even more intimidating than the waiting room. The ceiling stretched up so high that Daniel had to tilt his head back to see it. Red velvet curtains framed a stage where a grand piano sat under a single spotlight. The instrument was black and glossy, probably worth more than his mom's car. Maybe worth more than his whole apartment building. Mrs. Hayes walked to the front row and sat down, crossing her legs and placing the clipboard on her lap. A younger woman, maybe an assistant, sat beside her with a pen ready. "Well," Mrs. Hayes said, looking at Daniel expectantly, "what instrument do you play?" Daniel's throat felt dry. "Piano." He saw the director's eyebrow raise slightly. She glanced down at his application, flipping through the mostly empty pages. No private lessons listed, no competitions won, no certificates or awards, nothing that proved he should be standing on this stage. Mrs. Hayes leaned back in her chair and let out a small laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the laugh of someone who'd seen this situation 100 times before and knew exactly how it would end. She turned to her assistant, speaking loud enough for Daniel to hear every word. "If this boy can actually play the piano, I'll surrender right here. I'll hand over my position and retire today." The assistant giggled nervously. Mrs. Hayes smiled, clearly pleased with her own joke. She'd probably said something similar to dozens of hopeful kids who showed up unprepared and unqualified, thinking they could walk into Wellington Academy on talent alone. Daniel felt his face get hot. Part of him wanted to turn around and walk out. Part of him wanted to tell this woman exactly what he thought of her and her fancy school. But another part of him, the part that had spent the last 3 years teaching himself to play on a broken keyboard at school, the part that heard music in everything from rainfall to traffic sounds, that part stayed quiet and kept him rooted to the spot. "Go ahead then," Mrs. Hayes said, waving her hand dismissively toward the piano. "Show us what you've got." Daniel walked across the stage. Each step echoed in the huge room. He could feel Mrs. Hayes watching him, probably already composing the gentle rejection speech she'd give afterward. Something like, "You have potential, but you need proper training first. Perhaps try the community center." He reached the piano bench and sat down. The seat was the perfect height, probably adjusted for the previous student. Daniel's hands were shaking as he placed them in his lap for a moment. He closed his eyes and took a breath. This morning, his mom had asked him what he was going to play. He'd told her Chopin, one of the nocturnes. She'd smiled even though she didn't know much about classical music. Play it like you mean it, she'd said. That's the only thing that matters. Daniel opened his eyes and positioned his hands over the keys. The piano was so much nicer than anything he'd ever played before. The keys looked perfect, all of them the right color, none of them stuck or silent like the ones at school. He took one more breath and began to play. The first notes seemed to hang in the air like crystals. Daniel's fingers found their way across the keys as if they'd been playing this exact piano their whole lives. He'd learned this piece by watching a video on his phone about 1,000 times, playing along on his desk, on his leg, on any surface he could find until his mom could afford the library card that gave him access to the school's music room. The melody filled the audition hall, every note clear and purposeful. But it wasn't just about hitting the right keys at the right time. Daniel played the way he felt the music, letting the sad parts breathe, pushing the passionate sections forward, making the quiet moments so tender they almost hurt. He forgot about Mrs. Hayes. He forgot about the expensive chairs and the crystal chandelier. He forgot about his shoes with the hole and the borrowed backpack. There was only the music and the way it moved through him like a story only he could tell. In the front row, Mrs. Hayes had gone completely still. The pen in her assistant's hand hovered over the paper, frozen midair. The dismissive smile had vanished from the director's face, replaced by something that looked almost like shock. Daniel's fingers danced across the keys, faster now, building toward the crescendo. He could feel every emotion he'd poured into learning this piece. Every lunch break spent practicing, every night he'd replayed the melody in his head because he couldn't get to an actual piano. All of it came out through his hands. When he played the final notes, letting them fade slowly into silence, the room felt different. The air itself seemed changed somehow, charged with something Daniel couldn't name. He lifted his hands from the keys and finally looked up. Mrs. Hayes was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Her mouth was slightly open, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she looked like she didn't know what to say. The silence in the audition hall stretched on for what felt like forever. Daniel sat at the piano bench, his hands still resting on his lap, waiting for someone to say something. Anything. Mrs. Hayes stood up slowly from her seat. Her assistant looked at her with wide eyes like she was watching something impossible happen. The director walked toward the stage, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Each step echoed in the quiet room. She stopped at the edge of the stage and looked up at Daniel. Her face had completely changed from a few minutes ago. The smugness was gone. The ready-made rejection speech she'd probably prepared had disappeared from her mind. Where did you learn to play like that? Her voice was different now, too. Softer, almost confused. Daniel shifted uncomfortably on the bench. I taught myself, ma'am. Mostly from videos online, Mrs. Hayes blinked. Videos. Online videos. She said it like she was trying to convince herself she'd heard correctly. What about your teacher? Your private instructor? I don't have one, Daniel said quietly. My music teacher at school, Mr. Peterson, he's the one who told my mom I should audition here. But he teaches general music class, not piano specifically. The director climbed the steps onto the stage. Up close, Daniel could see that her hands were trembling slightly. She walked over to the piano and ran her fingers along its edge like she was trying to ground herself in something real. How long have you been playing? About 3 years, I think. Maybe a little more. Mrs. Hayes turned to look at him sharply. 3 years? That's impossible. The technique you just displayed, the emotional maturity in your interpretation, that takes a decade of intensive study. Minimum. Daniel didn't know what to say to that. He just shrugged a little. I practice a lot. On what instrument? The director's questions were coming faster now, like she was trying to solve a mystery. Where do you practice? There's an old keyboard in the music room at my school. One of the churches downtown donated it a few years ago. Some of the keys don't work anymore and it doesn't sound great, but it's something. Daniel paused, then added, Sometimes I stay after school until the janitor locks up, and during lunch if no one else is using the room. The assistant had joined them on stage now, still clutching her clipboard. Mrs. Hayes, should I? The director held up her hand for silence. She was staring at Daniel like she was seeing him for the first time. Play something else, she said suddenly. Anything you want. Daniel felt a flutter of nerves again. What should I play? I don't care, Beethoven, Mozart, a pop song. I want to understand what I'm dealing with here. Daniel thought for a moment, then turned back to the piano. He decided on one of Beethoven's sonatas, the Pathétique. It was a piece he'd fallen in love with late at night, listening to it through his phone's tinny speakers while his mom slept in the next room. His fingers found the opening chords, powerful and dramatic. The sound filled the hall again, and this time Daniel felt more confident. He let the music take him where it wanted to go, following the melody through its dark valleys and bright peaks. When he finished, Mrs. Hayes immediately said, again, something different. So Daniel played Debussy, then a piece by Rachmaninoff that he'd probably messed up in places because it was so technically difficult. Then one of the modern composers his teacher had mentioned once. Each time he finished, Mrs. Hayes asked for another. After the fifth piece, Daniel's fingers were starting to tire. Mrs. Hayes finally held up her hand to stop. "You have perfect pitch," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded. He'd learned that term a few months ago when he'd mentioned to Mr. Peterson that he could tell what note any sound was making. The hum of the refrigerator, the beep of a car horn, the squeak of a door. His teacher had explained that it was rare, that most musicians spent their whole lives without developing that skill. Mrs. Hayes sat down on the edge of the stage, which was something Daniel guessed she never did. Her perfect posture had relaxed and she looked tired suddenly. "How do you learn these pieces? Just by listening?" "Mostly, yeah. I watch performances online and listen to recordings. Then I try to copy what they do. Sometimes I find the sheet music at the library and study it there. But I'm not great at reading music yet. It's easier for me to just hear it and play it." The director closed her eyes and pinched the bridge of her nose like she had a headache. 3 years, self-taught, on a broken keyboard. She opened her eyes and looked at him. "Do you compose?" Daniel hesitated. He hadn't told anyone about that, not even Mr. Peterson. It felt too personal, too private. "A little bit." "Define a little bit." "I write things down sometimes. In notebooks. Melodies that get stuck in my head. I don't have regular access to a piano at home, so I just write the notes on paper and imagine how they'd sound together." Mrs. Hayes stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of the stage again. Her assistant followed her, and they spoke in low voices that Daniel couldn't quite hear. He saw the assistant's eyes go wide a few times, saw her shake her head in disbelief. Mrs. Hayes kept gesturing back toward Daniel, her voice getting more animated. Finally, the director turned around and walked back to him. "Daniel Rodriguez," she said formally, like she was making an announcement. "I'm accepting you into the Wellington Academy's Advanced Youth Program with a full scholarship. Tuition, materials, everything covered." Daniel's heart jumped. "Really? But that's not all." Mrs. Hayes crossed her arms. "You'll have access to our practice room 7 days a week. Early morning, late evening, whenever you can make it. And I'm going to teach you myself." The assistant gasped. "Mrs. Hayes, you haven't taken on a private student in 15 years. "I know." The director didn't take her eyes off Daniel. "But I'm not going to let talent like this slip through the cracks because of bureaucracy or tradition or whatever excuse we might come up with." Daniel felt like he couldn't breathe. A full scholarship, private lessons with the director herself, access to real pianos whenever he wanted. It was more than he'd ever imagined when his mom had driven him here this morning. "There's one condition," Mrs. Hayes said, her voice serious. "You have to promise me you'll work harder than you've ever worked in your life. Real training is different from teaching yourself. It's going to be frustrating sometimes. You're going to learn that some of the techniques you developed on your own aren't quite right. And unlearning bad habits is harder than learning good ones from the start." "I promise," Daniel said immediately. "I'll work as hard as you need me to." Mrs. Hayes almost smiled. "Almost. I'm going to hold you to that." She glanced at her assistant. "Get the paperwork started. Full scholarship package, and clear my schedule for Tuesday and Thursday afternoons." As the assistant hurried off, still looking shocked, Mrs. Hayes turned back to Daniel. "You know what you did to me today?" Daniel shook his head. "You reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place, not because of prestige or perfect technique or expensive instruments, but because of moments like the one you just created. Raw, honest, real." She paused. "Do you know how rare that is?" "No, ma'am. Very rare. I've heard thousands of auditions over the decades. Most of them blur together. Technical proficiency without soul. Perfect notes without feeling. But you?" She shook her head slowly. "You made me feel something. That's the difference between a musician and an artist. Daniel felt his eyes getting hot with tears he wouldn't let fall. Not here, not now, Mrs. Hayes noticed anyway. Her expression softened in a way Daniel wouldn't have thought possible when he first met her. Go home, tell your mother, celebrate. But be ready to work when classes start next week. Because I'm not going to go easy on you just because you impressed me today. Understood? Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much. As Daniel left the audition hall, he heard whispers from the waiting room. The other kids and parents had heard everything through the walls. Some looked jealous. Some looked confused. One mother was already on her phone, probably calling someone to complain about the scholarship going to a kid with no pedigree. Daniel didn't care. He walked through that fancy waiting room with his head held high, his worn-out sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. He couldn't wait to tell his mom. 3 months had passed since that audition, and Daniel was exhausted in ways he'd never been before. He woke up at 5:30 every morning to catch the earliest bus to Wellington Academy. The practice rooms opened at 6, and he'd promised Mrs. Hayes he'd be there. Some mornings his fingers were so stiff from the cold that it took 20 minutes just to warm them up enough to play properly. School started at 8. Regular school, with regular classes like algebra and history that he still had to ace because his mom wouldn't accept anything less than perfect grades. She'd told him that music was a gift, but education was insurance. He couldn't argue with that logic. After regular school ended at 3, he'd rush back to Wellington for his actual classes there. Music theory, composition, ear training. Even though he didn't really need it, he was learning to read sheet music fluently now, which was harder than he'd expected. His brain wanted to just hear the music and play it, but Mrs. Hayes insisted he learn to do it the traditional way too. Then came private lessons with Mrs. Hayes herself every Tuesday and Thursday at 4. Those 2 hours were the hardest and the best part of his week. Today was Thursday, and Daniel was already in the practice room, working on a Chopin etude that Mrs. Hayes had assigned him. His fingers kept stumbling over the same section, the one with the rapid runs that required perfect coordination between both hands. He tried it again. Missed the same notes. Again, still wrong. He slammed his hands down on the keys in frustration, creating an ugly clash of sound that made him wince. That's not going to help. Daniel jumped and turned around. Mrs. Hayes stood in the doorway, earlier than usual, watching him with those sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. Sorry, Daniel muttered. I didn't know you were there, clearly. She walked into the room and set her bag down on the chair in the corner. What's wrong with that passage? I don't know. My fingers won't do what I want them to do. Mrs. Hayes came to stand beside the piano. Play it for me, slowly. Daniel took a breath and played the section at half speed. It sounded fine that way. Again. Slower. He played it even slower, each note deliberate and clear. You see? You know the notes. You know the fingering. So what's the problem when you speed it up? Daniel shook his head. I don't know. Yes, you do. Think about it. He sat there staring at the keys. Then it hit him. I'm trying too hard. I'm thinking about each individual finger instead of just letting the phrase flow. Mrs. Hayes nodded. Exactly. You're getting in your own way. This is what I warned you about on your first day. Unlearning is harder than learning. Daniel felt a wave of frustration wash over him. When I taught myself, I didn't have to think about any of this. I just played, I know, and that's both your greatest strength and your biggest obstacle right now. Mrs. Hayes pulled up the chair and sat down, something she only did when she wanted to have a real conversation. You have natural talent that 99% of musicians would kill for. But natural talent alone has a ceiling. To go beyond that, you need technique, structure, discipline. What if I can't do both? Daniel's voice came out smaller than he intended. What if learning the proper way makes me lose whatever made me special in the first place? It was the fear he'd been carrying for 3 months but hadn't said out loud until now. Mrs. Hayes was quiet for a moment. You want to know something? When I first started training seriously, I was about your age. I grew up in a tiny apartment in the city, and my mother cleaned offices at night to pay for my lessons. I was good. Really good. But when I got to conservatory, I felt like everyone else was better than me. They had all gone to fancy prep schools and had famous teachers and played on expensive instruments their whole lives. Daniel looked at her, surprised. He'd never heard Mrs. Hayes talk about her own past before. I felt like an imposter, she continued, Like I'd somehow tricked everyone into thinking I belonged there, and the more I tried to fit in, to play like everyone else, the more I lost touch with why I loved music in the first place. She paused. It took me years to understand that I didn't need to choose between technique and authenticity. I needed both. How did you figure it out? By making the same mistakes you're making now. By getting frustrated and wanting to quit. By wondering if it was all worth it. She stood up and walked to the piano. But here's what I learned. Technique isn't a cage. It's a foundation. Once you master it, really master it, it becomes invisible. It becomes part of you. And then your natural instincts have even more freedom because you're not limited by what your hands can physically do. Daniel thought about that. It made sense, but it still felt far away from where he was now. Let me ask you something, Mrs. Hayes said. Why do you play piano? The question caught him off guard. I don't know. I just love it. Not good enough. Why do you love it? Daniel struggled to put it into words. Because when I play, everything else goes away. All the stress about money and school and my mom working all the time and wondering if we'll make rent. When I'm playing, none of that exists. It's just me and the music and this feeling like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Mrs. Hayes smiled. And it was a real smile, not the tight professional one she usually wore. That feeling? That's what you need to hold on to. The technique I'm teaching you isn't meant to replace that. It's meant to give you more tools to express it. She sat down at the piano bench. Watch my hands. She played the passage that Daniel had been struggling with, but slowly enough that he could see exactly what she was doing. Her fingers moved with an efficiency that looked effortless. No wasted motion, each note perfectly connected to the next. Now you try. But don't think about the notes. Think about the phrase as a whole. What is Chopin trying to say in this moment? What emotion is he expressing? Daniel positioned his hands and tried again. This time, instead of thinking about finger positions and timing, he thought about the feeling of the music. The passage was supposed to be like water flowing, unstoppable and natural. His fingers found the rhythm. The notes came out smoother, more connected. Not perfect, but better. There, Mrs. Hayes said quietly. That's it. That's the balance. Over the next hour, they worked through the rest of the piece. Mrs. Hayes pointed out things Daniel had never considered. The way a slight pause could add emotion. How the dynamic changes told a story. The importance of the quiet moments, not just the loud ones. When the lesson ended, Daniel felt drained, but in a good way. Like he'd actually learned something important, not just memorized notes. As he packed up his things, Mrs. Hayes said, Daniel, I need to tell you something. He looked up, worried by her serious tone. Word has gotten around about you. Some of the parents are talking. Some of the other students, too. Daniel's stomach dropped. He'd noticed the whispers in the hallways, the way some kids avoided him while others stared. What are they saying? Mrs. Hayes sighed. The usual ignorant things people say when they feel threatened. That I only accepted you because of diversity quotas. That you don't actually belong here. That your audition was somehow a fluke. Daniel felt his face get hot. Is that what you think? Of course not. I think you're one of the most talented students I've ever taught. But I need you to be prepared for this. Not everyone is going to be happy about your success. Some people have worked their whole lives to get where you got in 3 months, and they don't understand that talent doesn't care about money or connections. So what do I do? Mrs. Hayes looked at him steadily. You prove them wrong. Not by arguing or defending yourself, but by becoming so undeniably good that they have no choice but to respect you. Let your playing speak for itself. Daniel nodded slowly. He thought about his mom, who dealt with people looking down on her every day at the diner but kept her head high and did her job with dignity. He could do the same. There's something else, Mrs. Hayes said. In 3 months, Wellington is hosting its annual showcase. It's a big event. Donors, critics, representatives from competitions and universities. I want you to perform. Daniel's eyes went wide. Me, but I just started here. I know. And it's going to make some people very unhappy. But you're ready. Or you will be by then. She picked up her bag. Think about it. If you want to do it, we'll need to choose your piece carefully, something that shows what you're capable of. As Daniel left Wellington that evening, the sun was already setting. He was tired and his fingers ached, and he still had homework to do for his regular classes. But walking to the bus stop, he felt something he hadn't felt in a while. Hope. Real hope that maybe he could actually do this. Daniel stared at the notebook in front of him. The pages filled with musical notation he'd been working on for weeks. It was 2 weeks before the showcase, and he'd made a decision that terrified him. He wasn't going to play a classical piece. Mrs. Hayes had suggested several options. A Beethoven sonata, a Liszt rhapsody, something impressive and traditional that would prove he could handle the technical demands of serious classical music. But every time Daniel sat down to practice those pieces, something felt wrong. They were beautiful, and he could play them well enough, but they didn't feel like his story. So he'd started composing his own piece instead. The knock on the practice room door made him jump. He quickly closed the notebook as Mrs. Hayes walked in. "You're here early," she said, setting down her coffee cup. Then she noticed his guilty expression. "What are you hiding?" "Nothing." Mrs. Hayes raised an eyebrow. After 6 months of lessons, she could read him like a book. "Daniel," he sighed and pushed the notebook toward her. "I've been working on something. For the showcase." She picked it up and flipped through the pages, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched on so long that Daniel felt sick to his stomach. This was a mistake. He should have stuck with Beethoven. "This is what you want to perform?" Mrs. Hayes finally asked. "Yes, maybe. I don't know." Daniel ran his hand through his hair. "I know it's not traditional. I know it's risky. But those classical pieces, they're not really me." "This is." Mrs. Hayes studied the notation more carefully. "You're blending classical techniques with jazz harmonies, and these rhythms, they're not standard. They're from my neighborhood," Daniel explained, the words tumbling out. "Like the number 7 bus that my mom takes to work. It has this specific sound when it breaks. And there's this church 2 blocks from our apartment that plays gospel music on Sunday mornings. And the corner store where everyone speaks different languages. And they all blend together into this kind of music if you really listen." He stopped, feeling foolish. Mrs. Hayes was probably going to tell him this was exactly the kind of unprofessional decision that would prove all the gossip about him right. But instead, she sat down slowly, still looking at the notebook. "Play it for me." Daniel's hands were shaking as he positioned them on the keys. He'd been working on this piece late at night in the practice rooms when no one else was around, afraid someone would hear it and laugh. It wasn't like anything being taught at Wellington Academy. He started playing. The opening was gentle, almost classical, but then it shifted into something different. The rhythm of the bus, the call-and-response feel of gospel music, the way different melodies could exist together, like voices in a conversation. The piece was about his journey, the struggle, the fear of not belonging, but also the hope, the determination, the feeling of finding something beautiful in unexpected places. When he finished, he was afraid to look at Mrs. Hayes. "That's what you're going to play," she said firmly. Daniel's head snapped up. "Really? It's risky. It's unconventional. Some of the board members are going to hate it." She closed the notebook and handed it back to him. "But it's honest. And it's brilliant. This is exactly what I meant when I said technique should serve your authentic voice, not replace it." Relief flooded through Daniel. "You really think it's good?" "I think it's you. And that's what matters." She stood up. "But we only have 2 weeks. If you're going to perform an original composition at the Wellington Showcase, it needs to be perfect. Not technically perfect, but emotionally perfect. Every note has to mean something." For the next 2 weeks, Daniel lived and breathed that piece. He practiced until his fingers cramped. He made changes, adjusting harmonies and refining transitions. Mrs. Hayes pushed him harder than she ever had before, making him play sections over and over until they felt right. The other students noticed something was different. They'd expected him to be practicing one of the standard repertoire pieces. But the music coming from his practice room didn't sound like anything they recognized. 3 days before the showcase, Daniel overheard a conversation in the hallway that made his blood run cold. "Did you hear what he's planning to play?" It was Robert, a senior who'd been at Wellington since he was 6 years old. His father was on the Academy's board of directors. "Some piece he wrote himself," another voice replied. "Can you imagine? The arrogance. My father says Mrs. Hayes has lost her mind. She's risking the Academy's reputation by putting him on stage. He doesn't have the training or the background for something like this. I heard someone say she only accepted him because of his sob story. You know, poor kid from the bad part of town. Makes the school look good for diversity or whatever." Daniel stood frozen around the corner, his stomach churning. The showcase has donors and critics coming. Important people. And she's going to let him embarrass himself and the school with some amateur composition? Robert laughed. I almost feel bad for the kid. He has no idea what he's walking into. Daniel didn't go to the practice room that day. He went home early, telling his mom he didn't feel well. It wasn't a lie. He felt sick. That night he sat on his bed staring at the notebook full of his composition. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe this was arrogant. Who was he to think he could write something worthy of performing at Wellington Academy? He'd been playing piano for 3 years. These other students had been training their whole lives. His mom knocked softly on his door. "Daniel, you okay, baby?" "Yeah, Mom." She came in anyway and sat on the edge of his bed. "You want to talk about it?" Daniel told her everything. The composition, the overheard conversation, the fear that he was making a huge mistake. His mom listened quietly until he finished. Then she took his hand. "You know what I do every day at the diner?" Daniel shook his head. "I serve people who don't see me." "Not really. They see a waitress, someone beneath them, and some of them are rude about it. Some of them treat me like I'm invisible or stupid." She squeezed his hand. "But I show up every day and I do my job with dignity. You know why?" "Why?" "Because I know my worth isn't determined by what they think of me. My worth comes from knowing I'm doing my best, providing for my son, living with integrity." She brushed the hair from his forehead like she used to when he was little. "Those kids at that school, they're scared of you." "Scared? Of me?" "Of course. You walked into their world with nothing but talent and heart, and in 6 months you've accomplished what took them years with all their advantages. That's threatening. So they try to tear you down with words because they can't compete with your music." Daniel felt tears prick his eyes. "You have a gift, baby, a real gift. And you've worked so hard. Don't let fear or other people's jealousy steal that from you." She picked up his notebook. "Is this piece good?" "I think so. Mrs. Hayes thinks so too." "Then that's all that matters. You play your truth. Let them play theirs. And when that night comes, you show them exactly who Daniel Rodriguez is." The next morning, Daniel arrived at Wellington before sunrise. He went straight to the practice room and played his composition. Then he played it again. And again. Mrs. Hayes found him there at noon. "Have you eaten anything today?" He shook his head. She handed him a sandwich from her bag. "Eat, then play it for me one more time." He ate mechanically, then positioned his hands on the keys. This time when he played, he didn't think about Robert or the board members or the critics who would be in the audience. He thought about his mom working double shifts. He thought about Mr. Peterson who believed in him. He thought about every morning waking up at 5:30 and every late night practicing until his fingers ached. He thought about why he loved music in the first place. When he finished, Mrs. Hayes had tears in her eyes. "That's it. That's exactly it. Whatever you were feeling just now, hold on to that for the showcase." 2 days before the performance, the program was printed and distributed. Daniel's name appeared near the end. Daniel Rodriguez performing an original composition. The whispers got louder. Some people were curious, others were openly skeptical. A few parents had apparently complained to the board, questioning Mrs. Hayes' judgment, but Mrs. Hayes didn't waver. "You earned this spot," she told Daniel. "Now go out there and prove why." The night of the showcase arrived faster than Daniel expected. The concert hall at Wellington Academy was packed. Every seat was filled with people in expensive suits and elegant dresses. Daniel peeked through the stage curtain and felt his stomach drop. He recognized some faces from magazines and news articles. Music critics, donors who funded the academy, representatives from prestigious competitions and universities. These were people who could make or break a young musician's career with a single review. His mom was out there somewhere too. She'd borrowed a dress from her co-worker and left work early for the first time in years. Daniel had seen her in the audience earlier, sitting near the back, looking proud and nervous at the same time. Backstage, the other performers were getting ready. A girl with a violin was doing breathing exercises. A boy in a tuxedo was silently fingering through his cello piece. Everyone seemed calm and prepared. They'd all done this before. Daniel was scheduled to perform last. Mrs. Hayes had insisted on it. End strong, she'd said. Give them something to remember. Right now, that decision felt like a curse. He had to sit through the entire program, watching everyone else perform beautifully, feeling his anxiety build with each passing minute. The performances were flawless. Each student played with technical precision and polish. The audience applauded politely after every piece, and Daniel could hear murmurs of appreciation. These were exactly the kind of performances Wellington Academy was known for. Safe. Traditional. Perfect. Then came the intermission. Daniel went back to the practice room to warm up his fingers. They felt stiff with nerves. He played through a few scales, trying to calm his racing heart. Mrs. Hayes found him there. She didn't say anything at first, just listened to him play. When he stopped, she walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. "You know what I remember most about my first major performance?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "I was so nervous I almost threw up backstage. I was 17, and I'd been chosen to perform at a competition that could change my entire future. All I could think about was all the ways I could mess up." She smiled at the memory. "But then I remembered something my teacher told me," she said. "The audience doesn't want to see you fail. They want to be moved. Give them that gift." "What? If they don't like it?" Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. "What if I embarrass you?" Mrs. Hayes turned him to face her. "Listen to me. In 32 years of running this academy, I have never been more certain of a student's ability than I am of yours right now. You're not going out there to prove anything to those people. You're going out there to share something true. That's all art ever is." The 5-minute warning came over the speaker system. Intermission was ending. Mrs. Hayes walked Daniel to the side stage entrance. "Remember why you play," she said quietly. "Everything else is just noise." Daniel nodded, not trusting his voice. The lights in the concert hall dimmed. The audience settled back into their seats. The master of ceremonies walked onto the stage and announced the final performance of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have something special for you tonight. Our final performer is a first-year student who has shown remarkable promise in his short time at Wellington Academy. Please welcome Daniel Rodriguez, performing an original composition." The polite applause was mixed with whispers. Daniel could feel the skepticism in the room as he walked onto the stage. He saw a few board members exchange glances. Some critics looked down at their programs with raised eyebrows. Original composition? By a first-year student? Who does he think he is? Daniel sat at the piano bench. The spotlight was so bright he couldn't see individual faces anymore, just a sea of shadows watching him, judging him. He placed his hands on the keys and closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his mom and those early mornings on the bus. He thought about Mr. Peterson, who saw something in him when no one else did. He thought about the broken keyboard at school and the countless hours he'd spent teaching himself to play. He thought about Mrs. Hayes taking a chance on a kid with no credentials and believing in him even when he didn't believe in himself. He thought about his neighborhood, the sounds that shaped him, the struggle and beauty existing side by side in a way that rich people in fancy concert halls might never understand but needed to hear anyway. Daniel opened his eyes and began to play. The opening notes were soft, almost hesitant, like someone unsure of their place in the world. The melody was simple but honest. Then it began to grow, building with confidence. The rhythm of the city bus merged with classical techniques Mrs. Hayes had taught him. Jazz harmonies bloomed unexpectedly, adding color and depth. He could feel the audience's attention shift. The whispers stopped. People leaned forward in their seats. The piece moved through different emotions. Struggle, doubt, the weight of being underestimated. But then it transformed into something else. Hope, determination, the joy of discovering you belong in a space that wasn't built for you but is yours anyway. Daniel's fingers flew across the keys now, fully confident. He wasn't thinking about technique or theory or what the critics might write. He was just playing his truth, letting it pour out through the music. The gospel influences came through, that call and response pattern that spoke to something deeper than notes on a page. The piece represented every different voice in his neighborhood, all those languages and cultures blending into something uniquely beautiful. He built to the crescendo, the moment where everything came together, all the struggle and doubt and hard work culminating in this understanding that he didn't need to choose between where he came from and where he was going. He could be both. He could honor his roots while reaching for something bigger. The final notes rang out clear and strong, then faded slowly into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The concert hall was completely still. Daniel's heart sank. He'd failed. They hated it. Then someone started clapping. Just one person at first. Daniel looked up and saw Mrs. Hayes standing in the wings, tears streaming down her face, applauding with everything she had. Then someone else stood. And another. And another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet. The applause was thunderous, nothing like the polite appreciation after the other performances. This was different. This was real. Daniel saw critics furiously writing notes. He saw board members nodding to each other with surprised expressions. He saw his mom in the back row, standing and crying and clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. The applause went on and on. Some people were actually cheering. A few young students in the audience looked inspired, like they'd just seen what was possible when you dared to be yourself. Mrs. Hayes walked onto the stage, still crying. She didn't care that everyone could see. She pulled Daniel into a hug and whispered in his ear, I told you this would happen." When Daniel finally left the stage, he was swarmed by people. Critics wanted interviews. Competition representatives offered invitations. University scouts handed him business cards. Parents who'd gossiped about him weeks ago were suddenly trying to congratulate him. But the moment Daniel would remember most came later, after the crowd had thinned. Mrs. Hayes found him in the practice room sitting at the piano, still trying to process what had happened. She sat down beside him on the bench. "You know what you did tonight?" Daniel shook his head. "You reminded everyone in that hall why music matters, not because it's perfect or traditional or safe, but because it's honest, because it connects us to something real." She put her hand over his on the keys. "That first day you auditioned, I made a joke. I said if you could play, I'd surrender right there." Daniel remembered. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I did surrender that day," Mrs. Hayes continued. "I surrendered to the reminder that everything I thought I knew about talent and training and who belongs in spaces like this could be challenged. You've taught me as much as I've taught you these past months." "Thank you," Daniel said softly, "for seeing something in me when everyone else just saw my worn-out shoes." Mrs. Hayes smiled. "Those shoes walked you exactly where you needed to be." Later that night, Daniel and his mom took the bus home together. She kept squeezing his hand, unable to stop smiling. "I'm so proud of you, baby. So proud. I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. All those shifts you worked, all those sacrifices." She shook her head. "That's what mothers do. But what you did tonight? That was all you. That talent, that heart, that courage to be yourself even when it was scary. That's who you are." Daniel looked out the bus window at the city passing by, the same streets he'd grown up on, the same sounds that had inspired his composition. Nothing had changed out here, but everything had changed for him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges, more people who doubted him, more moments when he questioned himself. But tonight had proved something important. He belonged. Not because he'd learned to be like everyone else, but because he'd stayed true to himself. And that made all the difference.